part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Thank you for downloading the Chase Smith Podcast, proudly part of the Press Play Podcast Network. In this episode, I interview Steve Olsher, founder, editor-in-chief of Podcast Magazine. We talk about his many business ventures, his journey into podcasting, his magazine, Podcast Magazine, the accessibility of podcast, the unending reach of podcast, and the future of podcasting. Let's get it! Here with me, he's the founder and editor-in-chief of Podcast Magazine. He's a business entrepreneur, a crypto connoisseur, Steve Olsher. Steve, thanks for joining the podcast, brother.
Hey, man. Thanks for having me.
Is that a fair lead? Is that a fair intro? I feel like I covered all of what you do there.
There's been a few other things over the years, and my wife and I are opening a funeral home. But other than that, I think you covered it.
Wait, you're currently opening a funeral home, or you have?
No, we currently are here in San Diego.
Oh my goodness. Wow, well, you truly are, Steve, like the most interesting man in the world. I follow you on socials. Just a few weeks ago, we're like an ice bath brotherhood thing, like something going on. You just interviewed Paris Hilton, and I think I saw pictures of like a mountain climbing. I don't know if I'm making that up. It fees like it fits. Are you the most interesting man in the world, Steve?
I'm going to say yes, because the other guy I think is dead at this point. So
oh, no.
I'm gonna take that crown.
Wonderful. So, Steve, I'm bringing you on as I'm doing this mini series on podcast. We've had incredible people on to help us look at podcasting from different types of angles. And before, Steve, we dive into the reach of podcasts, I wanted to give our listeners a chance to get to know you a little bit better, Steve. So, we kind of tongue in cheek touched on all that you do, but you truly do have a lot of interest, a lot of successful business ventures on top of what you've done in podcasting. So just if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and what kind of sparked some interest in what you're doing now.
Yeah. 30 years as an entrepreneur now. So
wow.
Started way back out in the early days as the DJ and clubs, and that led to actually my opening my own club when I was 19. So that was my first real entrepreneurial endeavor, and kind of got my feet wet in that entrepreneurial space. Obviously at 19, you learn a ton just by doing, and actually at any age you learn pretty much everything just by doing. But it really just kind of triggered me into thinking, this is something that I could do, where maybe the sort of the typical course of working for somebody else and that sort of thing just didn't really fit my personality. And so really early on, we got involved in all the good stuff going on online. Mm-hmm. Launched a store on CompuServe's Electronic Mall back in '93. Oh, yeah. And that store became liquor.com, like what you drink, when I bought that domain along with bourbon.com.
Smart.
And
good investment.
Eventually built that up and sold that to Berry Dealers IAC. And then along the way did about 50 odd million in real estate development and coaching and speaking, and put a book on the New York Times list. And so, lots of different things going on, but you definitely covered it.
Okay, good. And recently kind of diving into crypto, Steve, what have you learned over I'm sure it's kind of like an insane journey. When did you start dipping your toes into crypto?
Yeah, it's about 2017, I think, was about the first year that I actually bought anything in that world, so to speak. And I didn't go heavy in at that time, just kind of a little bit here, a little bit there, but really did find it pretty interesting from the first time that I heard about what was going on there in those markets. And so around about 2020 or so, started going much deeper into the space. And in 2021, we launched our own coin, which is called Bold Coin. And Bold Coin trades on the Rally.io network there. So it's like, I guess what some people would call a creator coin. Mm-hmm. And then I've been really active in the world of NFTs and just all sorts of different opportunities in the Web3 space and teaching around that as well. But it's either going to be the biggest scam and Ponzi scheme that we've ever seen in the history of mankind, or there's actually going to be something here.
Yeah, and for it to be the largest Ponzi scheme, I mean, at this point, there's already so much money and so many people just rolling with it. Even if it started as a Ponzi scheme, I think it's just gotten too big to pull the rug out from under people at this point. That's at least my super novice observation, Steve. I don't know. I'm not as deep into it as you, but it does seem to be a little bit bigger than that kind of Ponzi scheme, like, possibility at this point.
Yeah, I think it depends on where people are getting involved. I mean, at the top of the pyramid, so to speak, if we're going to look at it in that way, I think Bitcoin at this point is probably too big to fail. Only because there's always going to be someone who's going to put a dollar value on, and dollar meaning, any sort of fiat, right? I mean, all over the world, obviously, it's a universal currency. So whether it's people in Russia or people in Asia or people in Europe or people in Africa or people in North America, or wherever it might be, at some point, if the price drops low enough, people are going to say that's too cheap, and I'm going to buy it.
There's a value there.
So there's a value there. So in other words, I don't think Bitcoin ever goes to zero. I think there's enough momentum there and enough believers there for it never to go to zero. I can't say that around anything else. Like, I can't tell you that the JPEGs aren't going to all go to zero. I can't tell you that even Ethereum and any of the altcoins or shitcoins won't go to zero. But my hope is that doesn't happen, right?
Yeah.
And at the same token, if you want to play that out completely, I mean, we can look at what's happened in the general markets right now. And I mean, the markets are as much of a Ponzi scheme as anything, right? I mean, when you just simply look at who makes the money, it's
and who sets the prices in the direction of that too. Like, it's
yeah. I mean, and look at what happened with Pfizer, right? I mean, Pfizer in 2021 had its biggest year ever in terms of net profit, right? And so who's making that money? I mean, the top 0.1%, and then it trickles down to everyone else, right? So, we could sit here and say everything that we want to say about crypto, and it's a scam, and this, that, and the other. And of course, I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here. I'm a believer.
Yeah.
But at the same token, I mean, really, you all you got to do is look at what's going on in the general markets, and you could certainly make the argument that most of those stocks that are trading for whatever they're trading for ostensibly could go to zero if enough of the insiders just pulled the rug on those too.
Yeah. Yeah. You definitely are a pioneer, Steve. And I want to kind of pivot this conversation because I don't know if I could have any further conversation about crypto or NFTs. I want to talk about podcasting because that's what I love. That's what we're talking about. And before we talk about Podcast Magazine and the reach of podcasts, Steve, do you remember where you were when you first heard about podcasts?
2009 is when I first heard about podcasts, and that's when we actually released our first episode of Reinvention Radio. So I've been playing in that space for a long time, and I don't remember where I was. I don't even remember the first show that I listened to, but I do remember thinking, because I had been buying brokered time on a local radio station.
Okay.
And so I had been thinking at that point, like, this is kind of crazy. Like, I'm putting out all this money, and unless you're driving in the car or at home with this particular very small AM radio station
at this particular time,
at this particular moment in time, you're not going to hear what I'm saying.
Yep.
So when you think about it, like, that's just such a small fraction of the people, the number of people that walk this planet. And I remember thinking, well, this is kind of like having my own radio station, so to speak. It's WSTEVE or whatever, we're calling it, right? I mean, it's, it's like kind of my own thing. And people can listen to what it is that I'm putting out at any time from any place on their preferred device. And that seems to be a much better opportunity, and the costs involved at that time, as they are now, were pretty minimal. So it was just hard for me to continue making the argument that I needed to continue to buy that brokered time, rather than just trying to put out my own podcast to see what would happen.
Yeah, I've been referring to it as a la carte radio, which is really kind of what podcasting is in a sense. It does give regular people who aren't in media or journalists the power and opportunity to say, hey, I have a voice and I want to talk about fill in the blank, literally whatever you want to talk about. You can create a podcast or radio show, and people who have those similar interests or ideas or passions can also, then you can find that community. Some of these conversations I've had with some incredible people here, we've talked about like the depth of podcasting, how you really can, reach certain depths in these intimate conversations, the influence of podcasting, the networking you find, the community in podcasting, the brand marketing of podcasting. It was 2006, and I've shared this a couple of times before. It's 2006. I was a freshman in college, and I love the Cleveland Browns, Steve. Anyone who knows me, that's not something I'm shy about. I was like, I just want to know more about the Browns. And so I fired up Apple iTunes, not knowing what I would find, and just typed in Browns. I don't know, maybe it's just my generation just searching random things and random search engines, but they're up this random Browns podcast that was just by fans like me. And it was incredible. And I was like, oh my gosh, if this is replicable or able to be done individually, then this is going to change the game. It's going to change the game for not only brands, but advertisers and everything, because you're able to capture and listen and play this content whenever it's easiest for you. And I think it was the perfect time with the growth of technology, and you had those smartphones, which I think kind of changed the game as well, Steve. And I wanted to talk to you because you've been able to leverage this medium and this community into a magazine. So Steve, if you want to stick around just a few moments, we're going to take a break and come back and talk about Podcast Magazine and the community you've been able to develop with even spaces and things like that. I know
hey everyone,
spaces,
it's
but you've
JD
been
from
big
the
on
Hyman
Clubhouse
Podcast.
as well. So Steve,
Backed
stick around.
by popular
We'll be right
demand. I'm excited to let you know that new episodes of the Hyman Podcast will drop every other Monday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We're going to continue the conversations we started last season and keep having those hard conversations. There is so much in store for you this season, and I'm excited to share it with you. Subscribe today so you don't miss a single moment. The Hyman Podcast, part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hello, this is Don Mike Mendoza, the host of the Producing While Asian podcast. Join us to listen in on conversations with everyone who identify from producers to non-producers who all are part of the AAPI community. There's all that and more on the Producing While Asian podcast here on the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hello, Brooks here with the Books with Brooks monthly book club podcast. Listen, it is beyond time for you to join a book club. I know you've been thinking about it, and everyone's doing it. Here's how Books with Brooks works. We read one book a month, and then we talk about it. Classics like Stephen King's The Shining, debut novels like We Are the Brennans by Tracy Lang, and tons of other compelling, life-changing stories, one book and 1 month at a time. So come read along with us and then listen in.
All right, we're back on the Chase Smith podcast magazine founder, Steve Olsher, among other things with us. Steve, you have founded an editor-in-chief of Podcast Magazine. At what point in your podcasting did you realize, oh, this was an avenue that you could kind of explore and really bring people together like this?
It was, it was pretty early on where we started gaining some traction with Reinvention Radio, where I felt like, this is just an opportunity to do what I've always wanted to do, which, for me, radio has always kind of been the holy grail. Mm-hmm. And just the opportunity to be able to just talk, right? And just talk and make a living from just really the words that come out of my mouth, right?
Yeah.
I just remember thinking like, well, this is pretty interesting. This is something where I think that if this goes the way that it potentially can go, then the average Joe, Jane, without anyone's stamp of approval, without anyone saying, hey, you're given the green light to do this project, whatever this project is, anyone can literally go ahead and just say, hey, there's something that's on my heart, something that's on my mind, something that I want to talk about, and find a decent audience who shares that sort of thinking. And some audiences obviously are going to be bigger, some are going to be smaller. But I certainly remember in that moment of hearing some feedback around our show, feeling like, if people are going to find value in what it is that I'm talking about, then, needless to say, there's value in what other people are talking about. And I think this medium holds some pretty meaningful potential.
One of my favorite lines from the first part of our show, Steve, you just learn by doing, right? And you just jump in kind of head first, both feet in whatever you're doing. Have you ever launched a magazine before you launched Podcast Magazine?
No, and I'm still not necessarily convinced we have a magazine. We'll see. I mean, we put this thing out. It's it's beautiful. I mean, our designer does an amazing job with it every single month. But I still have yet to think of myself as the publisher or something on the lines of what you see people like Vogue and Vanity Fair and some of those other publications doing. But we're working our way there. I mean, we're entering our third year right now. And we're making our way just through this, navigating this terrain one issue at a time. And you're right. I mean, it was just learning by doing. I mean, never launched a magazine before, but I really did feel like there was an opportunity here to more than anything else, just validate the industry that so many of us believe in. And without a magazine that really is... I mean, what else would you call it, right? I mean, it's got to be Podcast Magazine, and that's obviously what we opted to call it. But without, a magazine like Sports Illustrated for sports, or like Car and Driver for the automobile industry, like it's almost illegitimate until there's some sort of publication that speaks for that industry on a consistent basis.
Yeah, there was a need there, and I think you touched on an important aspect of that, is just legitimizing this industry, trying to find a way to bring some type of structure and some semblance of order in an industry and a medium that is really all about chaos and free market. And it's really anyone and everyone can do a podcast about anything. And so you're seeing some of these other opportunities and businesses or like structures that can help support. There's all different types of award ceremonies, right, Steve? I'm sure you guys get solicited with probably a new award ceremony every other month, right? There's some type of like community, or I haven't seen, I know podcast academies trying to like do like a guild, right? Some type of like, because podcasting kind of is in the realm of entertainment and media, and it's kind of all over the place. So is there like a some type of guild or
I mean, there's the Podcast Academy, and the Podcast Academy is definitely doing its part to try to bring folks together. There's the National Podcasters Association. I did see somebody not too long ago. They shared something with us about that. I don't know how they're doing, but there are people who are trying to let's just say legitimize the industry in their own ways as well, and even just standardize the industry in terms of, hey, a person who does this is their title, and the person who has this title should be earning this sort of of salary on a consistent basis. So just trying to create some standards right around the industry in and of itself, and all these let's just call them initiatives I think are really, really powerful steps in the right direction for the industry.
Yes, and one I think that has been consistent is podcast movement, Steve. And this is where you guys had a booth there. I went by and introduced myself, I'm sure, as you were, all things of stuff going on there. But Podcast Movement's a conference, right? You got to have a conference with whatever industry you have. And it's just this massive, kind of like 4 or 5 day conference where you get together and talk about the podcasting and how to start and all different aspects, sponsorships, networking, all different types of stuff. And that's been huge at least to the everyday podcaster as well.
Yeah. Well, we're actually taking that to the next level ourselves as well, because I think there's a real need for a Comic Con-esque type event for the podcast industry, and so we're going to move in that direction. So we're going to launch an event called Pod Expo, and so Pod Expo, the idea there is really to create something that's more consumer facing, and have something where the events that exist right now are great for podcasters.
Yes.
But they're not really consumer facing events.
As in like for fans.
As in for fans, yeah.
Yes,
exactly.
I took my network to podcast movement this year, and it was very inside baseball industry leaning heavy. And for podcasters who already know what they're doing, already have kind of their crap together, we had a different experience than someone who was like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I want to do podcasting. And so something like this, where especially as podcasting expands its reach and more people, Steve, are familiar with podcasting. We're seeing cars with native podcast apps, right? We're seeing smart home devices who now pull, whether it's sports talk or, trends and like society and like conversations from podcasts. It's just going to be more and more accessible, and having actual fans is, I think is another kind of aspect that is really untapped. And I think you nailed it, man, especially as you see podcasts who are selling their rights to Hollywood or TV shows. You're seeing all types of podcast series being turned into whatever. There's even a show on Hulu about a podcast about listening to it. Like it was like this Only Murders in the Building. Are you familiar with that one?
No. What? Tell me that one. What is it called?
Oh man, Only Murders in the Building. It's with Steve Martin Short, and Selena Gomez, and it chronicles this high-rise apartment in New York City, and there was a murder in their apartment. And so the pilot shows these three characters. They all have to evacuate the apartment, and they go to like the restaurant across the street. But as they're evacuated, they're all listening to the same murder mystery podcast, which is a fake podcast that the show created. But they end up at the bar, and they're all like realize they're listening to the same podcast that they all love and obsessed about, and they talk about it. But then they realize, we just had a murder. We could start our own murder mystery podcast about our own building. And they end up doing that. Man. And it's just almost too on the nose to watch. It was super. I mean, I'm a big Steve Martin and Martin Short fan anyway, so it wasn't a hard sell for me. It's a fun watch. It's a good show.
Yeah, fun.
But the reach is just going to continue to grow. And some of these shows have like crazy fans. And another part of this, Steve, talk about the reach, like the live show aspect of podcasts was really took a hit, I think, because of COVID. But I would not be surprised if the rest of this year, and especially into 2023, that becomes like a legitimate like venue, almost like a concert-y kind of like option for podcast hosts and networks to pursue as a form of hey, like we're going to put this on and we're going to sell tickets and all this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the timing, I think, for us to do this event makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. And obviously the pent up, let's get together in person stuff. And then just with the growth of the industry, I think if we just look at the numbers, the podcast industry as a whole was not hurt by the pandemic.
No, it wasn't. Not at all. I think some of these other like live community events were, but the reach of podcast only grew. The amount of podcasts only grew. The podcast and the zeitgeist only became more normal and natural. Steve, where do you see the reach of podcasts going over the next 2, 3, 5 years?
It's certainly at an interesting tipping point, right? I mean, the reality is, for this industry to only be a $1 billion plus industry in terms of ad revenue at this juncture, it's concerning. So what does that mean? It means that growth has been slower than expected from a monetization standpoint. And if there's not enough money there, you're going to start to see money move in other directions. I mean, much as you're seeing with Web3 and the amount of money being invested in the world of Web3 right now. When you compare the amount of money being invested in the world of Web3 to the amount of money being invested in the podcast landscape, It's not even close.
Mm-hmm.
So why is that? Does the market speak for itself when it sees opportunity or when it sees problems? I mean, we certainly can look at history and understand that where the money goes, that's where attention flows, right? So I think podcasting as an industry has its work cut out for itself. I mean, it definitely needs to figure out how to create an actual culture. And that's part of what we're looking at as well, right? I mean, in terms of how do you create, like if you look at skateboarding as an example, and you look at Thrasher, like Thrasher has done a really good job of capturing the essence of skateboard culture. Like when you think about a person who is into skateboarding, there's a certain look, feel, way of life that person has and engages in, right?
Yeah.
When you think about podcasts and podcast listeners and people who raise their hand to say, hey, I listen to a podcast, like it's just not the same. You don't have that same sense of podcast culture in the way that you do in other environments. So the point being, the industry itself needs to come up with its own got milk sort of campaign, right? And really figure out how to band together to create something that the industry can get behind and support, and ultimately give the industry the opportunity to really grow, because now folks have an understanding of really what it is that they're subscribing to, and make it a part of who they are, as opposed to just a show that they listen to. And that's really what we need to do here, is we need to give people, meaning consumers, ownership of the industry. And right now they just have ownership of individual shows.
But I think, isn't that the appeal of the reach of podcast? It is for everyone. And there is a podcast about everything, and it transcends cultures, and it transcends just gender and whatever. Literally anyone can start a podcast about anything and reach everyone. And so I think like there's an appeal there. And maybe we just came up with a campaign there. I don't know. But I think like that's unique with this, right? I mean, there's power in that uniqueness.
There is weakness in that uniqueness, unfortunately, because again, there's not a cohesive approach to what the industry really stands for. And I think that's part of, look, I get what you're saying. It makes sense what you're saying. And there's certainly a broad appeal around the nature of people being able to tune into shows that they like on an individual basis. Yes, I get that. But from an umbrella standpoint, I don't identify as a podcast listener. You know what I'm saying? Like that's part of what we have to be able to get the average consumer to be able to do, is take pride in the fact that they listen to podcasts. Very few people share the shows that they listen to, not in the same way that they do like with Netflix, not the same way that they do with, sort of more larger social movements, if you will. And that's an interesting discussion on its own. But if we're going to move out of this phase of being a $1 billion plus industry, something has to change.
That's super fascinating. And I think a great observation. There is this intimacy and this like personal, like, well, hey, these are my shows and no one knows what I listen to or subscribe to. And it is kind of a little intimidating sharing whether like your daily feed of what your home screen looks like or what shows you listen to. It is a little more personal than a TV show. And I think that is a fun conversation. Maybe something like this Pod Expo will help shed light on and say, oh, you listen to this, I listened to that one. Right. Which I think would be great. Well, Steve, this has been an incredible conversation. I am so thankful and grateful for you to come on. The most interesting man in the world on the Chase Smith podcast. Who would have thought Steve Olsher here joining us? And that does it for this episode of the Chase Smith podcast. Thank you all so much for downloading and listening. Shouts to the Press Play Podcast Network for making this possible. Follow us online at Press Play Pods. You can visit our website at pressplaypodcast.com to keep up with all of our shows and network news. And make sure to check the podcast magazine out. Steve, our network subscribes. We get it every month. It's beautiful. We get it digitally. And that's a whole nother conversation of like a digital magazine and a published like a print magazine, which I'm sure you guys have internally talked. We didn't get a chance to hit on. But Steve, where could these listeners follow and find all that you do, man? Let's plug some things.
Definitely start with Podcast Magazine. If you go to podcastmagazine.com/free, it's a private backdoor link. Yeah, it's a private backdoor link you can use there. Just our way of saying thanks for hanging out with us today and making it all the way to this point. So might as well get you a free subscription to the magazine. So podcastmagazine.com/free. It's a free lifetime subscription. Best place to start. And then just reach out, anytime. Always happy to chat. My info's in the magazine, and I'm happy to connect.
Great, Steve. Thank you so much, man. And we look forward to hearing info about Pod Expo. Maybe we can, partner and put on have a booth there or something.
Sounds good.
All right, Steve. Thanks,
all right,
man.
brother.
Have a good week.